Deep within the tunnels of Gaza, amidst rubble and subterranean passages that form a ghost city beneath the surface, one of the most complex and decisive intelligence operations in recent Middle Eastern history unfolded. The man who for decades challenged the Israeli security apparatus, who transformed Hamas into a sophisticated war machine, and who masterminded the most devastating attack against Israeli territory in 50 years, had finally been located. Yahya Sinwar, known in Israeli intelligence corridors simply as Target Number 1, was about to discover that even in the most protected depths of Gaza, the reach of the Mossad knew no limits. The operation that would culminate in his elimination did not begin on October 16, 2024, but years earlier, when Mossad analysts identified patterns of movement, communication habits, and vulnerabilities in the protection network surrounding the Hamas leader. The morning that would forever change the balance of power in the region began like any other in the tunnels of Rafah. Sinwar, always cautious, had developed over the years a security routine that was almost impenetrable. He never stayed in the same location for more than a few hours, communicated only through absolutely trusted messengers, and maintained a restricted circle of fighters around him willing to die to protect him. But Israeli intelligence had identified something that not even the most experienced Hamas strategist had realized. A subtle pattern in his movements, a preference for certain routes that, analyzed over months of electronic and human surveillance, revealed the existence of a main bunker where Sinwar felt truly safe. The man who had commanded Hamas operations since 2017 and who had assumed the overall leadership of the organization after the elimination of Ismail Haniyeh in August 2024, had built his reputation not only as a ruthless fighter, but as a meticulous scholar of his enemies. During 22 years in Israeli prisons, Sinwar dedicated himself to understanding the mentality, culture, and strategies of the Jewish state. He learned fluent Hebrew, studied Jewish history, and closely observed the functioning of the Israeli security system. This experience transformed him into something far more dangerous than a simple militant, an adversary who knew Israel as well as its own leaders. Born in 1962 in the Khan Yunis refugee camp, Sinwar grew up breathing the air of Palestinian resistance. His parents, expelled from Maydal Ashkelon during the 1948 war, raised their son with stories of the lost land and the promise of return. It was in this environment that the mindset of a man who would never accept any form of compromise with Israel was forged. By co-founding Majd in 1985, the internal security arm of Hamas responsible for eliminating Israeli collaborators, Sinwar demonstrated early on his willingness to use extreme methods in the name of the Palestinian cause. The nickname Butcher of Khan Yunis was not mere Israeli propaganda, but a reflection of the brutality with which he carried out executions of Palestinians suspected of collaborating with Israel. In 1989, his capture and conviction to 4 life sentences for multiple murders seemed to indicate the end of a terrorist career. However, prison only refined his skills and broadened his influence. He transformed the Israeli cells into centers of indoctrination, recruitment, and strategic planning, emerging in 2011 not as a defeated man, but as an even more determined and connected leader. The release of Sinwar in exchange for Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit was a decision that deeply divided Israeli society. Netanyahu approved the exchange under immense public pressure, but voices within the intelligence community warned that they were releasing future terrorist leaders. Sinwar returned to Gaza not only as a resistance hero, but as someone who had survived decades of imprisonment and emerged with an unprecedented understanding of how the Israeli security apparatus works. His meteoric rise through the Hamas hierarchy was not accidental, but the result of a unique combination of personal charisma, strategic knowledge, and credibility acquired through suffering. When he took command of Hamas in Gaza in 2017, replacing Ismail Haniyeh, Sinwar brought a strategic vision that would fundamentally transform the organization. He understood that Gaza alone would never have enough military resources to confront Israel on equal terms, but that integrated into the Iranian axis of resistance, it could become an existential threat to the Jewish state. Under his leadership, Hamas not only significantly expanded its arsenal of missiles and rockets, but also developed tunneling and subterranean warfare capabilities that would transform Gaza into a practically impregnable fortress. The regional geopolitical context in which Sinwar operated was one of increasing polarization between the Iranian axis and the coalition led by the United States and Israel. Hamas had evolved from a Palestinian resistance movement to a strategic component of the Iranian containment architecture against Israel. Sinwar perfectly understood this dynamic and knew how to leverage it to militarily strengthen his organization. With financial support, weaponry and training provided by Iran through complex smuggling networks, Hamas under his leadership had become a significant regional military force, capable of threatening not only Israeli border communities, but the very heart of the Jewish state. The attempted targeted assassination against Sinwar in 2021, from which he escaped unharmed, only increased his prestige within the Palestinian movement and consolidated his image of invincibility. He was a man who had challenged Israel for decades and always emerged stronger from each confrontation. This aura of indestructibility became a central part of his leadership, inspiring Hamas fighters and intimidating enemies. However, it also fueled in Sinwar a confidence that would eventually prove fatal, leading him to underestimate the adaptability and determination of the Israeli intelligence apparatus. The preparation for what would internally be known as Operation Iron Sword had begun long before October 7, 2023. For months, Sinwar and his closest collaborators meticulously planned what would be the most ambitious and devastating attack ever conducted by Hamas against Israeli territory. The operation revealed not only the military sophistication achieved by the organization under his leadership, but also his deep understanding of Israeli psychological and strategic vulnerabilities. By simultaneously breaching the defenses of the Gaza perimeter, infiltrating Israeli territories, and capturing hundreds of civilian hostages, Sinwar demonstrated that he had learned the most important lessons about asymmetric warfare and psychological warfare. More than 1,200 Israelis lost their lives during the October 7th attack, and hundreds of civilians were taken hostage to the Gaza tunnels. For Israeli society, accustomed to decades of military and intelligence superiority over its Arab adversaries, the operation represented a traumatic shock comparable to the early days of the Yom Kippur War in 1973. Sinwar had achieved something no Arab leader had since then, inflicting a devastating tactical defeat against Israel on its own territory, shattering the myth of the Jewish state's invulnerability and forcing it into a prolonged war under highly unfavorable conditions. The Israeli response was immediate and absolute. Within hours, Sinwar had been placed at the top of the priority target list, not only of Mossad and Shin Bet, but of the entire Israeli security apparatus. The subsequent military operation in Gaza was not aimed merely at weakening Hamas or recovering the captured hostages, but specifically at locating and eliminating the man who had masterminded the deepest national humiliation Israel had experienced in decades. Netanyahu made it clear in private statements that the war would not end while Sinwar remained alive, turning his elimination into the main strategic objective of the Israeli military campaign. Tracking a man who had dedicated decades to learning the art of clandestine survival, who knew every tunnel and every hideout in Gaza, who maintained an impermeable security network around him, and who could count on the unconditional support of thousands of fighters willing to die to protect him, represented an unprecedented intelligence challenge. Sinwar was not just a military target, but a phantom who had perfected the ability to disappear completely from Israeli intelligence radar whenever necessary. His elimination would require not only precise information about his location, but a coordinated operation involving multiple special units and perfect timing. For months after the October 7th attack, teams of analysts from Mossad, Shin Bet, and military intelligence worked 24 hours a day to map the tunnel network where Sinwar was hiding, identify patterns in his movements, and locate vulnerabilities in his protection system. Utilizing everything from electronic communications interception to human infiltration and analysis of data collected during ground operations in Gaza, Israeli intelligence services gradually built an increasingly precise picture of the Hamas leader's habits and preferences. It was a race against time, as every day Sinwar remained alive represented not only a propaganda victory for Hamas, but also an opportunity for him to reorganize his forces and plan new attacks. The discovery of Sinwar's approximate location came through a combination of electronic and human intelligence that represented the best of Israeli information-gathering capability. Communications interceptions revealed subtle patterns of movement between different sections of the Rafah tunnels, while Palestinian informants provided details about security changes in certain areas. More importantly, forensic analysis of material captured during ground operations allowed Israeli analysts to reconstruct the Hamas command structure and identify the inner circle of collaborators who had direct access to Sinwar. The decision to launch the final operation was made when multiple intelligence sources converged to indicate that Sinwar was using a specific bunker complex in Rafah as his main operational base. Unlike other hideouts he only used temporarily, this location seemed to offer the necessary security and communication conditions for him to maintain control over Hamas operations. Israeli intelligence had identified not only the complex's general location, but also the entry and exit patterns, the communication systems used, and even the approximate number of fighters serving as Sinwar's personal bodyguards. The operational plan developed for Sinwar's elimination involved unprecedented coordination between different branches of the Israeli security forces. Special units of the Israel Defense Forces would be responsible for the direct assault on the bunkers, while Shin Bet would provide real-time intelligence on movements within the underground complex. Mossad would coordinate the overall operation and ensure that all possible escape routes were simultaneously blocked. It was a plan that allowed no margin for error, as everyone knew that Sinwar would likely have only one real opportunity to be captured before he disappeared again into the depths of the Gaza tunnels. The morning of October 16, 2024, began with Sinwar following his usual security routine, moving through the tunnels accompanied by his most trusted bodyguards and personally checking different points of his defense system. He was unaware that, in the last 48 hours, Israeli special forces had silently infiltrated the Rafah area and established positions around all known accesses to his bunker complex. The operation had been planned to appear like a routine military patrol, so as not to arouse suspicion among the local population or Hamas fighters who might alert Sinwar to the Israeli presence. When the first explosions erupted simultaneously at multiple access points to the tunnels, Sinwar immediately understood that this was not a casual attack, but an operation specifically directed against him. Decades of experience in urban and subterranean warfare had taught him to recognize the signs of a targeted capture or elimination operation. However, the speed and coordination of the Israeli attack surpassed even his most pessimistic expectations. Within minutes, all the escape routes he had carefully prepared over the years were blocked, and the siege closed inexorably around his position. The final battle lasted several hours and involved intense fighting through the underground corridors that Sinwar knew better than any other human being. Utilizing every tactical advantage the terrain offered, he and his last collaborators fiercely resisted the advance of the Israeli special forces. However, the superiority in equipment, training, and operational intelligence gradually tilted the balance in favor of the attackers. When the last bunker was finally reached by Israeli troops, Sinwar made his final choice: to die fighting rather than allow his capture alive, thus maintaining his image of resistance until the last moment. The confirmation of Yahya Sinwar's death was met with contradictory feelings both in Israel and the Arab world. For Israeli society, it represented the closing of a traumatic chapter and the demonstration that even the most protected and determined enemies were not beyond the reach of justice. For Palestinians, especially in Gaza and refugee camps, the death of the man who had dedicated his life to resistance against the Israeli occupation created a new martyr whose example would inspire future generations of fighters. It was the eternal paradox of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Every military victory by one side fueled the narrative of resistance of the other, perpetuating the cycle of violence that has defined the region for decades. The operation that eliminated Sinwar represented the height of Israeli intelligence and special operations capability, demonstrating that even on hostile ground, against an adversary who knew every inch of the territory and had the fanatical protection of his subordinates, the Jewish state security apparatus could reach any target. However, it also revealed the inherent limitations of a strategy based exclusively on targeted eliminations. Sinwar's death significantly weakened Hamas and temporarily disorganized its operations, but it did not eliminate the political and social conditions that give rise to Palestinian resistance movements. Yahya Sinwar's legacy transcends his physical elimination and will continue to influence the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for decades. For millions of Palestinians, he represents the pure example of resistance, a man who never bowed to Israeli pressure, who transformed years of imprisonment into an opportunity for strategic learning, and who preferred to die fighting than to accept defeat. His journey from the Khan Yunis refugee camp to the supreme leadership of Hamas became a powerful narrative of ascent through struggle, inspiring young Palestinians growing up under occupation or in refugee camps to follow his example. Simultaneously, for Israel and much of the international community, Sinwar remains a symbol of the cruelest and most calculated terrorism. The architect of massacres, the man who used civilians as human shields and who transformed Gaza into an underground military base. His actions resulted in the deaths of hundreds of innocent Israeli civilians and the suffering of thousands of families who lost loved ones or live with uncertainty about the fate of captured hostages. This duality in his perception reflects the fundamental complexity of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where the heroes of one side are invariably the villains of the other. The deepest question raised by the operation that eliminated Sinwar concerns the effectiveness of targeted eliminations as a long-term strategy for resolving complex conflicts. Although Israel has demonstrated impressive technical capability to reach any adversary, history suggests that every eliminated leader is eventually replaced by another, often more radical and determined than their predecessor. The cycle of violence continues, fueled by the same political, social, and economic conditions that originally gave rise to the conflict. The true lesson of the operation against Sinwar may be that, in the contemporary Middle East, there are no definitive military solutions to fundamental political problems. Israel has developed the world's most sophisticated intelligence and special operations capabilities, capable of penetrating any defense and eliminating any threat. However, this tactical superiority has not translated into lasting strategic security, as it does not address the deep-rooted causes that continue to generate new adversaries. As long as there are refugee camps like Khan Yunis, as long as generations grow up under military occupation or under the trauma of terrorist attacks, there will always be individuals willing to follow Yahya Sinwar's example. The war in the shadows between Israel and its enemies continues, with each side constantly refining its techniques and strategies. Mossad and Shin Bet continue to develop increasingly sophisticated capabilities for intelligence gathering and covert operations, knowing that the terrorist threat never completely disappears, it only transforms and adapts. On the other side, organizations like Hamas learn from every defeat, develop new methods for protecting leadership, and recruit new fighters motivated by the narrative of martyrdom. It is a deadly game of action and reaction that defines the geopolitical reality of the contemporary Middle East. The final legacy of Yahya Sinwar and the operation that resulted in his elimination is still being written. His death marked the end of an era in Hamas leadership, but also the beginning of a new phase in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. New leaders will emerge, new strategies will be developed, and new intelligence operations will be planned. The only certainty is that as long as the fundamental issues fueling this conflict remain unresolved, the war in the shadows will continue, with every tactical victory planting the seeds of the next battle. The story of how Mossad hunted and eliminated the Hamas leader in an underground bunker reveals both the power and the limitations of modern intelligence warfare. It demonstrates that with sufficient resources, advanced technology, and political determination, it is possible to reach any adversary no matter how well protected. But it also illustrates the cyclical nature of violence in the Middle East, where every military solution generates new political problems. The elimination of Yahya Sinwar was an unquestionable tactical triumph for Israel. But its contribution to a lasting peace in the region remains an open question, the answer to which only the future can reveal.